Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week we are very excited to introduce the one, the only Miss Marple in The Murder at the Vicarage. It's first published in October of 1930 by, wait for it, this is also kind of exciting, the Collins Crime Club.
The what, you say?
I say the Collins Crime Club.
What is that? Please explain.
Let's talk about the Collins Crime Club. Yeah, the Collins Crime Club was a new imprint, and it was mostly made as a new imprint for Agatha Christie, because what they were doing essentially was encouraging readers through a monthly newsletter to purchase more mystery novels, and Agatha Christie obviously was a good way in. Christie had been published obviously by Collins, but this is the first one under that imprint, and I believe that the entirety of the rest of her mystery novels were published under the Collins Crime Club imprimatur. It existed up until the early 90s when the editor of it, I think, finally retired, and they essentially absorbed all of their mystery novels into the sort of general HarperCollins imprints.
That's pretty cool. Let's get to our victim. Jump right in. The victim is the fabulously named Colonel Lucius Prothero, and he is the local warden for the church, local magistrate, and he is found in the vicarage study shot in the head. He's also somewhat deaf, and he's married to a much younger woman. He's kind of a pain. Such a pain, in fact, that the vicar himself, who is narrating this tale, he is not even necessarily that sad to see him off. And basically, as we get into our suspects here, pretty much everyone, for some reason or other, hated Colonel Prothero and wanted him dead.
So who are the suspects? The answer is everyone! Exclamation point. Nobody likes this guy. First off, we have Vicar Leonard / Len Clement. He is the narrator. He's also the vicar of St. Mary Mead. And lest anybody say, whoa, he's the narrator, he can't be a suspect.
I feel like there's even a little trolley moment in which, it might be Miss Marple, but someone says, you even could be a suspect, Vicar. And he's like, who, me? And it almost seems like a little nod to a previous novel that we read. Yes, perhaps. Yes.
So essentially, Colonel Prothero has scheduled a visit with the Vicar Clement on the evening of his murder. And guess what? He's murdered in Clement's study in the midst of writing him a note. And it is, in fact, also Clement who finds his body.
Correct. So our next suspect is the wife of the vicar, Griselda Clement, and this is the vicar's much younger wife. She is something of a charming flirt and a gossip. Pretty much on page 1, we're told that she's fairly unsuitable for a vicar's wife, other than her name, the name of Griselda being a very suitable name for a vicar's wife. While she is ostensibly in London at the time of the murder, as we've learned in previous Christie stories, one cannot always rely on a train schedule. Where's Mussolini when you need him? So he's coming, actually. He's around
very
this time.
Soon, 1930. Yeah. Well, he's actually probably I think he's already figuring out the train schedules in Italy.
Right, that's true. He's like, I'm right here. We also learn later in the novel, has a past history with sexy painter Lawrence Redding, and is actually currently sitting for her portrait. So there's a lot of mystery, or at least intrigue, around whether or not Griselda is straying and an entirely faithful wife. Next, we have Mr. Hawes, who is the curate in the church, and he works underneath the vicar, and he seems like a big weirdo. He is just a mess throughout the course of this entire novel. It's like, what is going on with Mr. Hawes? And there's definitely something going on with Mr. Hawes. He's nervous all the time. He's constantly taking quote-unquote medicine for his nerves. He's shaking a lot. Just all sorts of suspicious goings-on there with Mr. Hawes.
Indeed. And then we have, because why not, we have Dr. Stone, a famous archaeologist, studying the historic barrows on the colonel's property.
Our next suspect is Mrs. Lestrange, who is a new resident of St. Mary Mead, and anyone new on the scene in an Agatha Christie novel is always immediately suspicious. She keeps to herself, yet more suspicious, has an air of illness, and she seems to have a bit of history with the town doctor, Dr. Haydock, and to just draw the sympathy of all the men around her. Something strange going on with Mrs. Lestrange. I see what you did there, Agatha Christie. I see what you did there.
So then we have Anne Prothero, the Colonel's, wait for it, much younger second wife. She's seems like a really genuinely nice person, and nobody seems to have anything against Anne Prothero. Maybe she's a little bit aloof. I think that's the biggest point against her, and her stepdaughter hates her.
Yeah, so her stepdaughter is one Lettice Prothero, another fantastic name, and in at least one of the adaptations,
she says it's Lettice.
Lettice, and they're like, no, honey, it's Lettice. She's rather young. She is the Colonel's daughter, the stepdaughter to Anne Prothero, as we mentioned, and she is being painted by the sexy painter Lawrence Redding, and she's very much flirting with him while he is painting her in her bathing suit.
Indeed,
no less.
Scandalous. Last, but certainly not
least.
We have sexy resident village painter Lawrence Redding. He's come on down to the countryside to...
I hear tell he has Irish blood in his veins.
Oh, he does. He does. He has his own little cottage, but the Vicarage has been kind enough to let him use a sexy painting shed in their backyard. He's just painting the village ladies left and right. Unfortunately, it's also his gun that's used to kill the Colonel. And as a result, it's poor Lawrence Redding who is primed to take the fall. And so, panicked Lawrence Redding also turns himself into the police, seemingly to protect someone.
Indeed. So let's talk about the state of the world as it appears to be before we get into solving this rather complicated and overstuffed mystery puzzle. So here's the situation. Money is being siphoned from the collections plate in St. Mary Mead, and Colonel Prothero is extremely irate about it. This is happening before we properly start our story, and that is why Prothero arranges to meet with Clement, because he wants to talk about that situation. So our vicar, Clement, he meanwhile is called out to see an ailing congregant, and upon his return, and by the way, he realizes that it was essentially a prank call because the congregant is fine. On his return, he runs into a frantic Lawrence Redding, who is leaving the vicarage in a state of shock, and Clement clocks that was weird, and then goes into the study of his vicarage and finds the body of the Colonel sitting at a writing desk, dead, shot in the back of the head, no gun to be seen, so this is clearly not a suicide, and in the midst of writing a note that has the time 6:20 written on the top, and then scrawled across it is the following: "Dear Clement, sorry, I cannot wait any longer, but I must." And that's it. And then there is, of course, also a clock that has been toppled over, and that clock stopped at the time of 6:22.
Because we know even from our last episode that clocks that topple over always have the right time of death.
Oh, absolutely, always. They're always just to be immediately trusted. And in fact, even with this one, almost right away, the vicar, since the vicar is the one narrating the story, informs us that he actually keeps that clock 15 minutes fast. So
he does.
Already the times here, which I don't think is even worth us parsing out as we're describing the state of the world as it appears to be, but suffice to say that there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding when exactly this murder happened within the space of about an hour between 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. It's a little bit all over the place. And I will just say, and I mentioned this in the witness for the prosecution because this was a plot point there as well, it drives me nuts that Christie seems to rely on this fiction that doctors can, with any sort of scientific certainty, know within matters of minutes when someone has died. It's just not true. That's at least my understanding. If anyone, by the way, would like to debate that point, we would be more than happy to hear from you.
I don't don't think it's within a couple. I mean, I think that depending on when you find the body and depending on what you know about the temperature in the room and outside temperature, and also I think the sort of rough metabolism of the victim at some level, like if they've been eating, like all of those kind of factors, you can figure it out, relatively closely. You can put it in a range of like 2 hours. I don't think
it's just used as it's used very conveniently here, and I think not quite scientifically. And for someone who gets scientific when it comes to her area of expertise, which is poisons in many novels, it's just to me, it's a bit of a glaring inaccuracy or fudging, which does not happen necessarily in other areas.
The weird thing that I would say about it is it's not even fudging. It's in this one particularly. This is within the last 30 minutes. And I'm sorry, like that is where the problem is here. It's like, the village doctor who's also like treating somebody's like chicken pox or something. Mm. The village doctor is not looking at this corpse and being like, this guy died in the last 30 minutes.
Right, this guy died within the last 30 minutes, but not 35. Like that's essentially what he's saying. Like it's insane.
I think it's literally what it's not essentially what he's saying. It's literally what he's saying.
It is literally what he's saying. It's literally what he's saying.
After they find the body, after Dr. Haydock comes, after we all find out that it's happened, in the last 30 precise minutes, we find out that Lawrence Redding went to the police station. He threw down his own gun and he tearfully declared that he was the murderer, much to everyone's absolute shock. And then an hour or two later, Anne Prothero hears this. She says that he's lying because, my God, she killed her husband. He's covering for her. He did not kill him. It was her all along. And they were having an affair and they just couldn't live without one another. And, neither of them knows the other confessed, but they both did. And essentially the police are like, seriously? Ultimately, they don't really have any evidence other than the confessions because actually both Anne and Lawrence were witnessed by other people.
And don't even seem to know that much about how they supposedly murdered the colonel. Their answers when they're asked about specifics are rather vague.
They're wrong.
Yeah, mm-hmm. So it seems pretty obvious that they're covering for one another. Meanwhile, Miss Jane Marple, who happens to be Miss Marple happens to be the vicar's neighbor. Her garden abuts the vicarage. She has pretty much seen everything going on out her back garden, and she herself and her powers of observation provide alibis for Lawrence Redding, for Anne Prothero, whom were seen at the time of the ostensible murder. And Miss Marple and a load of other people also all heard a shot, a strange-sounding shot, but a shot nonetheless, go off at around 6:30, which, again, was the latest possible time of death, according to Dr. Haycock. 6:30, but not 6:35. At the inquest, the death is ruled murder by person or persons unknown. The rest of the novel is taken up in untangling the very, very, very tangled web of not just who committed this murder, but several side plots in typical Christie fashion that have to be untangled along with it, and the clues that confuse and populate this story.
Let's run through some clues. The first one we've already complained about it. Time of death. Here's the thing. Prothero was told that Clement was running late. So he knew that he was going to have to be sitting there for a while. Yet, for some reason, he starts to write a note at 6:20. He writes the time on the top of it, and essentially he writes a note as though he's about to leave, even though he knows Clement is not going to show up until 6:30. So that's weird. And on top of that, then, if the clock fell over at 6:22, he wrote 6:20 on the top of the page, and the shot was heard at 6:30.
Yeah.
What else was going on then? And then on top of that, if you remember that the clock is turned forward 15 minutes because apparently Clement tends to run late, so the clock runs fast.
Although maybe the murderer knew that the clock ran fast and was actually using that to further confusion or something.
Definitely possible, but if the murderer didn't know that, then at 6:20 the clock was actually the time was actually 6:05.
Correct. so often in Christie, and we've seen this time and time again, especially in her novels. In The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the actual time of the murder was completely different from what it seemed to be. In The Mystery of the Blue Train, a murder happening, I believe, several hours before it seemed to have happened, so that it actually happened in a different city. And we, being seasoned Christie readers at this point, seeing everything that's going on with these times, we should be expecting that something is up with the timing, and it's not. It's at the very least not as it appears to be, and there is just some sort of weirdness and complication going on with that, and that will certainly be borne out.
Correct.
So, clue number 2, the note that Prothero writes to Clement doesn't necessarily look like Colonel Prothero's handwriting. His wife actually mentions that. And on top of that, the 620 written at the top of this hastily scrawled note appears to be in a different ink than the rest of the note, and also a different handwriting. It just seems out of place. So the deduction there is that there's just something really wrong with this note. We've certainly seen doctored notes before, going back to our very first novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. And either Prothero wrote it under duress, or he didn't write it at all, or some combination of the two. Perhaps then that note wasn't meant for the vicar. We should be mistrusting the note as well.
Right. We have a few other kind of big clues. They're made to be big clues in the course of the book, but one might say they're a little bit muddying the waters more than they are anything else. First off, Dr. Stone appears to have been in a number of arguments with the colonel prior to his death, particularly about his research and methodology.
So that's one clue. Next one is Mrs. Lestrange and her unusual habits. Again, this is the woman who recently moved to St. Mary Mead. No one knows her. She hides out in her house. She seems to have the sympathy of the doctor and pretty much any man that she meets. She got into quite an argument with the colonel at his home the day before the colonel's murder, so that's suspicious. And she also refuses to appear at the inquest. She says that she's too ill. She basically gets a doctor's note, right. Dr. Haydock. So the deduction is that all is not being told here. There is some sort of a relationship between Mrs. Lestrange and the colonel that has to explain why she's here, why she recently moved to St. Mary Mead. The relationship with the colonel is clearly toxic, so what is happening?
And so then also we have a pretty big deal made about the train schedule to St. Mary Mead. Part of this is because Griselda's alibi is that she's in London. And so Griselda's alibi relies on the fact that the train back from London arrives at 6:50. But we find out, or the vicar himself finds out, that the train schedule has been very off recently. The train is essentially half an hour late. So that means if Griselda was back at the vicarage around 7, which she was because we saw her there, she's lying. She wasn't on the train.
Okay, we have one final clue, a real clue this time, having to do with the murder, and I'm hopeful that perhaps we helped some readers ferret this one out for themselves, because we're told very early on that Lawrence Reading is not just a serviceable painter, but, quote, the kind of young man who does everything well. He is good at games, an excellent shot, a good amateur actor, and can tell a first-rate story. Did you all catch the key part there? Lawrence Reading is a good actor. So we should be extremely suspicious of him. And yes, people with acting skills aren't always the culprits. I'm looking at you, Lawrence Cavendish and Cynthia Murdoch from The Mysterious Affair at Styles. But we've seen it happen time and time again. And we can add to this the fact that Lawrence Reading is discovered having a torrid love affair not with Lettice Prothero, as many suspected, but with Anne Prothero, the colonel's wife. And we have every reason to, therefore, suspect him. As we should, because he and Anne working together are, in fact, the murderers, even though it takes us quite a while to get there. This case really relies on a bit of a twist and a bit of a trick, and I would argue that it's something that we've slightly seen before in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, because the couple who confessed to the crime in the beginning of our story, Lawrence Reading and Anne Prothero, actually turn out to, in fact, be guilty. They were confessing to the crime and then seeming to not exactly know how it happened and just to be protecting each other. And this was all a blind, because they had in fact done it, and confessing in this way and then being cleared by public opinion, not to mention the police, was part of their plan. And it's a little bit similar to the way that in The Mysterious Affair at Styles.
Or even Witness for the Prosecution.
Yeah, or in Witness for the Prosecution, where it's this idea that if someone has guilt attached to them at first and then is cleared in some convincing way of that guilt, be it either by an alibi or by someone who's caught out in a lie on a witness stand, say, it's difficult to then reverse course and go back to actually believing that that person is guilty. Difficult unless you're someone with the intelligence and cynicism of Miss Jane Marple. She got it.
She didn't want to. She does make that point repeatedly.
She didn't. The thing, though, that really drives Miss Marple, that struck me, this being the first Miss Marple novel that we read, which I don't get a sense of in the Poirot novels, is cynicism. It's this idea of unmasking people for who they really are. The novel is suffused with it, and Miss Marple's only mistake is that she's not quite cynical enough because she actually likes Lawrence Reading and Anne Prothero, so she believes them when they confess, and then she eventually, it takes her a while, but she gets to the point where she realizes, oh no, they're horrible people.
And this might actually speak a little bit to why, I guess, especially when I was young, why I preferred Poirot. Because I think even though Poirot knows every single terrible thing that people can do, he kind of wants to reassert order, and he kind of wants to set things right, ultimately. Whereas Miss Marple is a little bit unrelentingly bleak. Even though she wants to believe these people, she's basically right. People all have two faces. They all have dirty crimes, and she is just resigned to it.
See, I think resigned is actually not the right way of characterizing it because, as I said, I think the cynicism is there and it's unrelenting. The thing that saves it for me and why I have actually always preferred Miss Marple, because A, the cynicism pleases me on some level, which probably says more about me than Miss Marple, but it's comedy and lightness. And it's what people so often don't give Christie credit for, that she has a real sense of humor. We talked about how even in Seven Dials, there's that Woodhouseian thing that she's capable of doing. It's just, there's a lightness to all of this that makes it palatable.
I agree. I think especially when I was younger, I also watched a lot of Bewitched on Nick at Night. And it always occurred to me that Miss Marple, she has a much higher IQ than Gladys Kravitz, but she's essentially Gladys Kravitz.
There's something very strange about her.
Gladys, will you stop?
No, I will not. It is time that people found out about this house. Oh, weird things go on in here.
I mean, I would hate to live next to Miss Marple.
Yeah, she would know everything about you. But what's also great is that she also has self-awareness about it.
And it is presented in a much lighter way than Poirot is. Mm-hmm. And it reads lighter. I mean, the entire book reads much lighter than Poirot does. Even the underlying sentiment is cynicism. Tonally, it's different. And I mean, it's actually, I think that we can talk about this at greater length about the role of women in these books, especially older women. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Miss Marple is so dismissed because she's an older woman. I mean, it's a real feminist statement in 1930 that Christie's actually making here.
Oh, absolutely. Toward the end of the book, I actually wrote in the margin, this book is one long warning against underestimating women. And especially old women, because there are so many examples of it. And Inspector Slack, who is the inspector, who we could also argue is kind of a series-long character because he appears in a bunch of the other Miss Marples as well. Inspector Slack is fairly odious, but convincingly so. We talked about recently how Inspector Battle just wasn't a very convincing character. I found Slack entirely convincing, and even though odious, kind of delightfully odious, I loved to hate him in this novel. And, he says, she's a woman and women act in that silly way. You wouldn't believe the fool things I've known women do. And we know when Christie is writing that she is certainly not condoning what Inspector Slack is saying. She's actually, by putting it in his mouth, she is condemning it. But this statement really, if we're going to talk about the progressive message toward women, I just found really interesting. And this is when yet another authority figure, Constable Hurst, is speaking. And he says, anyway, no lady knows anything about time. And then the vicar, he says, I often wonder why the whole world is so prone to generalize. Generalizations are seldom if ever true and are usually utterly inaccurate. I have a poor sense of time myself, hence the keeping up by clock fast. And Miss Marple, I should say, has a very acute one. Her clocks keep time to the minute, and she herself is rigidly punctual on every occasion. I mean, she's basically saying, dude, don't stereotype. That's
although the vicar
wrong.
himself very early on tells Lawrence Reading, in fact, Lawrence is saying that nobody knows about the affair, nobody knows about his business, and the vicar says, "My dear young man, you underestimate the detective instinct of village life. In St. Mary Mead, everyone knows your most intimate affairs. There is no detective in England equal to a spinster lady of uncertain age with plenty of time on her hands."
Mm-hmm. It's not complimentary, but he's not dismissing them or denigrating them the way that many of the other men in this book do.
No, and Clement at no point dismisses the older ladies. Griselda does.
Right.
Griselda calls them old cats, I think.
Mm-hmm. There's tons of examples of casual ageism and misogyny in this book, and pretty much all of it is ultimately condemned, and the people who exhibit it the most, mainly Inspector Slack, end up having to eat crow for it, essentially, because Miss Marple is the one that utterly solves everything. I was thinking about this, too, where there's this whole idea, I think, within the amateur sleuth canon of classic crime, where at the end of the novel, the amateur sleuth often doesn't take credit for having actually solved the crime. Like, that's a very common end of the trope, and no one even knows that they did this. But it's none more so than with Miss Marple, because the vicar even says Miss Marple would actually be horrified if she was given credit and if people actually knew that she had taken such an active role, the implication being because that's not ladylike. And Poirot...
No, it is that, but I think that it's also because that is not her method. Her method is being unobserved. Her method is watching. And so she can't be Poirot, and she knows that she can never be Poirot. She cannot be the person who goes in and interviews people. She has to essentially be passive is not exactly the right word, but she has to appear passive in her ability to collect information about other people. And that is a feminine thing, obviously, to not appear to be the aggressor. And so, of course, she doesn't want credit, because if she is seen to be this person who essentially is collecting information, it's going to interfere with her actual ability to collect information. The reason why she gets told things by people in the village is, in fact, the opposite of why Poirot is told things.
I would argue with that. I would argue with that because we're told so many times, so Poirot is told things because he's a foreigner. And people discount him. And I would argue that no matter how much Miss Marple would even try to take credit for something, she would constantly be discounted anyway because she's an old lady. I don't think she's strategizing for future cases. I think she just realizes that that's not her place. It's an ultimate. It's like a conservative. It's a conservative button on something that's not actually a very conservative journey through the story.
Maybe. I mean, I slightly disagree. I kind of think Miss Marple is more cunning than that, and I think that Miss Marple wants access more than you might think that she does. Maybe that's my own cynicism towards Miss Marple.
No, I get it. I get what you're saying. I think that she's the perfect Christie heroine, actually. And we talked a little bit about this in previous episodes about how the idea of a Christie heroine has changed. It has certainly changed very much from Anne Bedingfeld, name-checked, or Tuppence, or any of those young, more thrillery heroines, and morphed into more of a Miss Marple because she rocks the boat, but she doesn't capsize the boat. Forgive me for extending that metaphor. She's doing interesting things within a social order, but she's not actually looking to overturn that social order.
This might be interesting, my friend, because this might be the first of our now long line of podcasts where we actually disagree with each other, because I think Miss Marple is a more sinister character than you do.
Okay, explain.
I think that ultimately Anne Bedingfeld or Tuppence, they're useful and they're obvious. Mm-hmm. And they're compelling in that regard, Anne in particular. But their ability to upset the apple cart is a public thing, and it's individual, and it is basically only related to them and what their actions are. Miss Marple is an insidious threat.
Wow.
I mean, obviously for good, because she's solving crimes, but she is there at all times. She's watching you. Yeah, she's not upsetting any apple cart, but she is more present than anybody. She has more access than anybody we've seen so far. She knows more details about people's personal lives and their habits than any other character we have in any of these stories or novels, including Poirot. I think that the thing about Miss Marple is that she is more dangerous than anybody, any character that Christie has. And, like, I think Christie knows that. I think this is deliberate. I think Christie got to a certain age and was like, you know what, you can't be that young girl, because at a certain point, first of all, you can't have that sort of youthful je ne sais quoi forever. And secondly, like, it becomes obvious. You're going to be more successful within the limits that society has to offer if you're somebody like Jane Marple, who essentially people are going to, I mean, they don't overlook her because everybody thinks she's a nosy busybody, but she's still getting all of this information and compiling it, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Correct me if this is not quite your argument, but you're saying maybe a case could be made that Miss Marple is almost like the ultimate of those shadowy characters, like the number 4 or the number 7, or those people who are not what they seem because she seems like someone who is dismissible or at least not important, not intelligent, what have you. But behind that mask is a beating brain that is capable of just as much as someone more obvious, such as, for example, Hercule Poirot. And there's something, even though she's ultimately working for good, there's something insidious and even a little bit frightening about that.
I think so, because if we think that sometimes Poirot can be a little bit frightening, because I think he can.
Do we think he can be frightening? I don't. That's the other thing. I mean, I was struck by how we so often laugh at Poirot. Even with Hastings, who himself is so laughable, and when he's narrating, there's a lot of laughing at Poirot. We never really laugh at Miss Marple in this novel, and I don't think in many of the others, partly because she's in on the joke herself. She knows how she's perceived. Right. So the self-awareness is there. And possibly because she's not all that laughable, as I would imagine you would argue.
I don't think she's laughable at all. That is exactly what I'm arguing. I think there's nothing laughable about Miss Marple.
I just don't think that I feel that there's like an insidious element to her necessarily, because you know what the difference is, though. To me, the people
you're not a
in
woman
those
and
thrillers,
you're not a woman and you don't have
that is one difference. One difference is I'm not a woman. But I think that the people in those thrillers, like the number 4s and the number 7s and the people that are pretending to be other than they are, they're doing it actively, obviously. They are going out and putting on a costume or disguising their voice or using their acting skills to affect evil. Miss Marple, that's just how other people perceive her. You're saying, though, that she's actually more active in pulling the wool over people's eyes. I think it's more that the joke is on people who are just misperceiving Miss Marple. I don't know if we're supposed to think that she is so active in the misapprehensions that people about her.
No, I don't think that she's deliberately causing that, but I think that she is fully aware of that, and I think that is used to her advantage.
Taking advantage of it, sure, but to me that takes out a bit of like whatever, an insidious quality to it. I think she's working with what she has.
You don't think that she's keeping a mental checklist or a sort of like dossier on every single person she's ever met? Because I do.
Miss Marple has a mind palace for sure. There's no question. It's detailed and exact and super organized, but I don't find that scary.
It's not like she's going to turn in one of these books and become some arch criminal. That's never going to happen. But at the same time, I think that the fact that she could exists to me. Right. I mean, that's always something that I thought about her.
You could make the same argument about Poirot. If Poirot wanted to become a criminal, he could. It just sounds like you think that it's more possible with Miss Marple. Do you think it's because she's more thwarted because she's a woman?
No, I don't think that she's thwarted, and I don't think that she thinks so. I think that she's excessively competent, and she knows exactly what she's doing in every single one of these. I think she knows what she's doing at every step in this. Incredible competence is also scary.
Why?
Because I don't think that she's indirectly picking up information. I think that she's doing it deliberately. Everything she knows is not like a byproduct of the fact that she casually picked it up while watching some birds. She deliberately picks everything up.
Well, of course she does, but so does Poirot. Why is it scary in Miss Marple and not in Poirot?
Because Poirot's job is a detective.
Sure. But
you don't think that it's if you had a neighbor who monitored all of your comings and goings, who knew every detail about you, who was like searching you on Google at all hours of the night.
It's not really scary unless you're doing something bad.
Okay, what you just said is the crux of all of this, right? None of this is scary unless you're doing something bad. And
what is bad?
Yeah, Anne and Lawrence aren't doing anything. Their affair is relatively innocuous until they cross the line into murder.
It's a pretty thick line. It's not like, oops, we just murdered someone. Especially with this murder, given the machinations it took to pull it off.
Right. We should probably explain what actually happened.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, as we were saying, the twist there is that the people who confessed actually did it, and they essentially very cleverly used Miss Marple and the fact that they know that she watches people and is constantly observing.
She was also aware of it.
Miss Marple was aware of it?
She was aware that she was being used, ultimately.
But it took her a while to get there. Miss Marple's only mistake in this book is that she's not quite cynical enough from the get-go. She actually believes that Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero...
I don't think she didn't believe it. She wanted it to be true. She even says basically as much.
That's even the mistake, wanting it to be true. I mean, that's right. What's so dark about this. Like, the idea that she wanted to believe that people could be not terrible, and then that was a mistake because people actually are terrible, at least in certain ways. So, yeah, I mean, Lawrence and Anne had all sorts of tricks up their sleeve. They were behind the call that got the vicar away. That's where Lawrence's acting skills came into play because he threw his voice, even making it sound female when he put in that call. Lawrence hid his gun in the vicarage study in a flower pot so that when Anne actually popped past Miss Marple in her garden in a very tight dress and no bag, which showed off the fact that she wasn't carrying anything, and just spent mere seconds in the study knowing that Miss Marple would be watching all of this, she was able to very quickly shoot her deaf husband, who never heard her coming, as he was sitting at the writing desk, and then just drop the gun and pop back out. And then Lawrence, when he came in to the vicarage, he was then able to pick up the gun, to make a switcheroo with the actual note that Colonel Prothero had been writing, and put in that doctored note there. He doctored the clock. He knew about the fact that the clock was going fast, so he was kind of screwing with all of the timing on all of this and just creating a lot of confusion. And they even went to the lengths of rigging up a sound that would sound somewhat like a shot, not at the time that they actually shot the vicar, but a bit later by means of an explosive crystal. That was a lot. And
I know, and apparently on like a timed match or something.
Yeah, it was like a long fuse match. I mean, I'm imagining Wile E. Coyote level.
It seemed a lot like Wile E. Coyote.
Yeah, I mean, that was just kind of ridiculous. And forgive us, but we didn't mention the fact that someone's maid heard a sneeze in the bushes, and it turns out that that sneeze was actually the gun because there was a silencer being used on the button. A Maxim silencer, as Miss Marple herself knows, because she's been checking out some American detective stories from the local library in St. Mary Mead. Just an incredibly complex mystery plot with all of those clues. And then in what we're realizing is typical Christie fashion, all these side plots swirling, many of which I was a little disappointed to find felt a little familiar given the novels that we've read before now. Dr. Stone, the archaeologist, turns out to be a cracksman and just a total fraud, which to me felt very similar to the beat of the doctor in The Mysterious Affair of Styles, who turns out to be a German spy. We find out that Mrs. Lestrange's secret is that she is Lettice Prothero's mother. And she wanted to be reunited with her daughter, and Colonel Prothero refused, so that's what they were arguing about. They do get reunited at the end. That, to me, felt very much like the beat in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, in which we have a long-lost son who's a drug abuser who comes to the house, that, same sort of a situation. And then all of the business with Griselda really comes to nothing. Griselda is, in fact, an extremely faithful and loving wife. If anything, the reason why she might have been acting a little erratic recently is that there might be a little Clement a little Clement bun in the oven.
Right.
And That, too, to me, just felt a little similar to the beats of John and Mary Cavendish and Mysterious Affair Styles having marital issues and then ultimately living happily ever after.
Right. I mean, the other...
We've seen this stuff before.
But then the other thing is the actual person stealing the money is Hawes, the curate.
The one who's been acting crazy the entire novel.
Correct. And that is why the Colonel went to the Vicarage in the first place. He went to go tattle on Hawes to Clement, and the actual note that he's writing is not this stupid 620 note. The actual note is essentially a letter to Clement saying, hey, your curate is stealing all this money. And then Redding and Anne plant the note in Hawes' pocket, and he's already a nervous wreck, and they switch out his anxiety medication with poison.
Right, so that he essentially seems to have poisoned himself and committed suicide over having been the murderer because his motive, he had a pretty clear motive to kill Colonel Prothero. Luckily, they catch Hawes in time. Dr. Haydock is able to resuscitate him. But I do have to note that other than the long fuse exploding crystal situation, the other most ridiculous part of the story for me was what Hawes suffers from, what he suffered from, which kind of led to his stealing in the first place. Encephalitis lethargica, a.k.a. sleepy sickness.
Yeah.
Which apparently can change a person's character. So it changed the formerly upright Hawes into a thief.
Haydock, the town doctor, says that even if it had been him who was the murderer, they would not have had him as a witness because he would have testified that the sleeping sickness really, really impacted his behavior.
Yeah, there is a really weird section just inserted into this novel I found very awkwardly, in which Haydock just expounds on his theories of criminality, in which he says that criminals aren't criminals because of a defect of character. It's actually a physical, i.e. glandular defect, a sort of chemical defect. And we may in the future be horrified that we ever punished criminals because they can't help it. And what I took away by the time I got to the end of the novel is that Christie had inserted that in there kind of as a straw man argument just to shoot it down, because when this gets real and Haydock is actually given the opportunity to aid in getting Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero actually punished into catching them, he is all about it. So his principles about, criminality should be forgiven and has nothing to do with someone's character and these poor criminals completely gets thrown out the window. And I feel like Christie was almost at a way making fun of it, not really giving it any sort of actual consideration. That was my take on it.
I think that, and I think that this falls under the weird category of he deserved it, the Colonel.
Right.
Because there is this trend in a lot of Christie stories that maybe we shouldn't feel that bad for the victim. So the real turning point for Haydock is the attempted murder of Hawes. Because,
absolutely, yeah.
And also he makes the point, which I think is fascinating, that he could not believe that anybody would do it because Hawes has a mother and a sister, and that the mother and the sister would have to live the rest of their lives not only thinking that their son and brother had killed himself, but that he had killed somebody else.
Right, that he was a murderer.
Yes, that he's a murderer. And that he cannot get over the fact that people would not only kill an innocent man, but also frame an innocent man for another person's murder.
Right, and affect those other living people. And it's such a good example of what we've been picking up on in a lot of these Christie novels, and what we will actually be speaking about at the Christie conference, ChristieCon in June. We'll have to include this. This is totally going to be part of our talk.
No, I had to bring it up deliberately for this purpose.
No, absolutely, because there really is this focus in Christie. We can refer to it as almost reparations, where it's the idea of how do we make the lives of the living and those whose lives will extend beyond this murder case, how do we make them whole? How do we make sure that the living can live happily? And who really cares about the dead person? Because he was kind of terrible anyway. It makes sense because the person who was killed has to be terrible in a lot of these stories, because there need to be a lot of people who wanted to kill him or her. So that's part of it. But it's just this interesting focus on the living as opposed to vengeance for the dead. And that's absolutely the case here. So yeah, that's an interesting part of the whole Haydock side plot with his feelings on criminality and whatnot. It's certainly not what I did not remember that from my first reading of The Murder at the Vicarage when I was probably 12 years old.
It's also a small detail, but it's also so relevant to the end game of it in the last few pages that because that's how they catch Redding and Anne. Without that turn, they don't get caught, essentially.
Right, Haydock is crucial to actually catching them out because they have no evidence. Again, all of this is circumstantial. It's all just Miss Marple in her brilliance figuring it out from the comfort of her drawing room and her homemade liqueurs, which sound delicious, by the way. Her cherry brandy. Yes, please.
I know, right? There's also such a level of drinking in this book. At some point, Clement offers, I think, slack. He says it's 11 o'clock.
He essentially roofies him. He applies him with,
roofies him.
He plies him with alcohol like super early just to get to like loosen up his lips. Yeah.
With the expensive brandy.
Yeah, and he has no compunction about it, too. He's, like, not in the least ashamed of it.
No. It's great.
It's great. Where we eventually get is that with Haydock's help, Lawrence Redding is put on notice that he may have been seen when he was switching out Oz's anxiety pills for poison. So he goes and throws rocks at Aunt Prothero's window, and they implicate themselves and are overheard discussing everything by police who are stationed around the Prothero's residence at the lodge. And yeah, they are put away and order is restored. The end.
The end.
Let's just really quickly mention the adaptations. We will have other opportunities to talk about the Miss Marple adaptations, which are a little bit more complicated than the Poirot ones, just because we have such a standard bearer in the Suchet series. We kind of have a bifurcation of the Miss Marples. There are, for the most part, 2 adaptations of each of these Marple stories. One of them comes from the 80s, mid to late 80s, Joan Hickson BBC adaptation titled Miss Marple, and then a number of years later, in the mid-aughts, there was an ITV adaptation done for 6 seasons, 3 of them with Geraldine McEwen and 3 of them with Julia Mackenzie as Miss Marple, and those are called Agatha Christie's Marple. And they're quite different. I would argue the Joan Hickson version is the truer version, and I think Joan Hickson is the closest thing we have to Miss Marple on screen in a way that neither Julia Mackenzie or Geraldine McEwen came close to, quite honestly, with all due respect to those 2 actresses.
Well, also, we should both note that we're olds, and the earlier adaptations obviously were things that ran on PBS in the US, so...
And both these adaptations, there's not that much to say about the adaptations themselves. They're rather faithful, especially the ITV adaptation, because a lot of those adaptations add a lot of different elements or sometimes even mix stories together. And there's a bit more of a departure in some cases, but nothing major.
The only thing that I would note is that the 2000s version adds an incredibly weird flashback plot.
True.
To Miss Marple, where she guessed the great love of her life going off to the war. I think he was married.
Yeah, they do this whole backstory with Miss Marple that I don't even want to get into because I thought it was crap.
Right, and we really don't need to discuss that any further, but it's really complicating the story in that version of it, and I was like, I don't know where this is coming from, but this is not the Miss Marple that I am familiar with.
Jane, I knew you'd come.
I had to.
Oh, my darling.
Miss Marple herself would have been offended.
Yes, she would have. I agree. In the aughts version, she also gets run down by a motorcycle, so she has to go through the whole
breaks her
episode
ankle.
with like a sprained ankle.
Yeah, in general, in the later adaptation, she's much more active. They make her a bit of an active sleuth, which again is just not what Miss Marple was. She has her moments actually in the books. I believe she sprays someone with soapy water in one story, if I remember correctly. And he's like, soapy water, I can't see. But yeah, they take it to another level in those adaptations. So more to come on those adaptations as we get into other Marple stories. But those 2 exist. And now let's get to our rankings. plot mechanics is our first category, and I think the plot mechanics are pretty good here. This is a puzzle mystery, and it's working, and it's a little disappointing to me that I was able to identify what seemed to be common tropes in these side plots, but on the other hand, use what works, I guess. That's not the worst thing in the world. So I certainly think that the plot mechanics are as good as we've seen in a lot of the mystery puzzles preceding it, and much better than in the thrillers.
For sure. I think a 7.
I think a 7 sounds good. Yeah, I'm cool with that. Let's say 7.
And then we're talking about plot credibility, and I think the reality is the plot is actually incredibly credible. If you minus the weird Barrows archaeology and all of these kind of red herrings and coincidences, they actually don't have anything to do with the actual plot. The actual plot is that a couple wanted to have sex with each other and run off together, but they also wanted the old guy's money, so they decided to murder him.
Right, no, it's true.
That is the plot of Murder at the Vicarage.
I don't think you can say that credibility suffers when the way in which the murder is affected is overly complicated, because that's the point of these stories, that it should be overly complicated because it's difficult to figure out. I do think that the exploding crystal with the long fuse
It's a little much
because it's just unnecessary. They didn't need that extra. Did they really need a weird shot to sound? I mean, I get that.
Well, they didn't need any gunshot at all, probably, is the thing.
Right, they could have used the silencer, and then that would have been it, and no one would have heard a shot, and there would have been someone that heard a weird sneeze, and that would have been fine. But that's a total quibble, and I think you're right. I think it's actually quite credible and character driven and based on emotions and people acting as regular human beings. So how about an 8? I don't think we've gone any higher than an 8, and I don't think I want to go higher than an 8 on this one, but I would be happy with an 8.
I'm inclined to say that we're never going to go higher than an 8 on credibility.
I don't know. I can think of one novel actually where I might go higher, but we'll say
an 8 for now. I'm fine with that.
Okay. Then detective characterization. This is the first time that we're seeing Miss Marple, so I think we kind of have to give this one a high mark. I will say, we were discussing this actually right before we started recording, it is interesting how we obviously know this is the first within the Marple series, but there are a bunch of other old spinster ladies in the town featured in this novel, and Miss Marple is one among them, and obviously she stands out.
Although the other ones pretty much suck, just to be clear.
Yeah, they're terrible. But, I mean, Miss Marple herself, the first time she's referenced by Griselda, she's referenced as that terrible Miss Marple. She is very much one of them. She stands out, and she distinguishes herself by the end of the novel, obviously. But if I didn't know that there was a Miss Marple series of novels, I wouldn't necessarily be able to pick that up from the end of this novel. I would think, oh, that Miss Marple sure is a smart one, but it didn't seem like they were establishing a series-long
and I think that we would be more inclined to think that this might be the adventures of Clement and Griselda.
Absolutely.
Len and Griselda.
Absolutely. That's a little bit of a ding, because without that, I would be saying we should give it a 9 or a 10, because I just love Miss Marple so much, but maybe a little bit lower than that.
Yeah, and I obviously think that Miss Marple is an arch villain, so you'd think that I would be also on board with that 9 or the 10. But yeah, 7 or an 8.
Okay, cool. Then one-off characters, I think actually do pretty well in this novel. Even though we do see Griselda and Len again in a novel or two, they're fairly minor. I think this is pretty much their book. Len is such a delightful narrator that you would almost wonder if this was a Dr. Shepard situation, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. I found him quite charming. Christie is really good at the charming. She's really good at charming first-person narrators. I get why she does third-person in so many of her novels, but she's quite good at the first person, and I really enjoyed Len.
He's funny. He has good asides. Mm-hmm. This is almost as good as we've had in any of the books, because he is such an incredibly, I think, charming narrator.
Yeah, the only issue with him, I did find it a little awkward that because it's a first-person narrator and he's just the vicar, that she's constantly figuring out ways to include him in the action.
I know. He gets invited to so many weird circumstances.
Yeah, and it's like everyone needs to talk to the vicar. Like he's the most in-demand vicar in history. And in the adaptations, they can dispense with that in the same way that everything having to be from Hastings' point of view can get a little bit awkward, but it was even more awkward here. But it didn't matter. I love the fact that it was from his point of view. And all the other characters within the village, even the old spinsters, they're awful, but there's some humor there, and they all seemed like real people, and I was into it.
Delightful.
Yeah, I was into it. I'm happy with a 7 on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Let's give it a 7, which is pretty high. Then setting and tone, this is the one area that I think is a bit weak, as it often is for these mystery puzzles. We are given 3 different diagrams within this novel, which is a bit overkill, but we're never really given a sense of what the town actually is like in the way that we often aren't in these books. It's pretty thin, the setting and the tone. Again, we have some humor in there and whatnot, but I don't think anything was bowling us over in the setting and tone department. I think that's fair to say. Would you agree?
Yeah, nothing.
And very little period detail. Let's give it a 4, which I think, I certainly don't think it wasn't abysmal. It's not like it was particularly bad. It just did not do any better than it often does in these mystery puzzles. And then Stuck in Its Time, again, Christie fares better in the closed environment stories because there's no xenophobia since there are no foreigners to be xenophobic too. The thrillers are the ones where we really see that xenophobia on full display, but the progressive elements of the condemning of ageism and even misogyny, I think you could argue, were in its favor. So I would say this one gets 0 deductions.
Yeah, I don't have anything I could think to deduct.
Okay. Would you like to do the honors, Catherine? Tally it up.
Asking me to do mental math. So 7, 8, 8, 7, 4, and 0 deductions. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that adds up to 34.
It does indeed, placing The Murder at the Vicarage in second place for our current roster. Yeah, so The Murder at the Vicarage is in second place with 34 points. Murder of Roger Ackroyd still in a comfortable lead at 37, but it just edged out The Man in the Brown Suit, I'm sorry to say, at 33 points. I'm fine with that because, again, I love me some Miss Marple. I guess that dastardly Miss Marple did it in the end. She was planning it all along.
I have such a soft spot for Man in the Brown Suit, which we've mentioned this before, but I think that in our adventures with Agatha Christie, that might be my biggest surprise.
And you know what? I think this is getting long enough, our roster. At this point, we now have 10 novels that it's probably worth our posting the roster, just if people want a little snapshot of what it looks like rather than my reading it off because it's going to take too long and be confusing. So just suffice to say, Murder of Roger Ackroyd still in first place and The Murder at the Vicarage now in second place. Fantastic. That is it for this week. Join us next week for a Poirot short story, The Case of the Missing Will, the next short story in the Poirot Investigates collection. And in the meantime, we would love to hear from you. As always, please email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find us on Facebook at a Facebook page, All About Agatha. You can find us on Instagram at All About Agatha. And if you do listen to this podcast via iTunes, please take a moment to rate and review us. And we will see you next week. Bye.
See you next week.